Good evening all. Welcome to the fourth event of Explore Islam Week, organised by the Cambridge University and Anglia-Ruskin University Islamic Society. Tonight we're going to be discussing the ethics of war with Timothy Winter. But first, we'll have a short Quranic recitation from Hamza, a University of Cambridge student.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وقاتلوا في سبيل الله الذين يقاتلونكم ولا تعتدوا إن الله لا يحب المعتدين واقتلوهم حيث ثقفتموهم وأخرجوهم من حيث أخرجوكم والفتنة أشد من القتل ولا تقاتلوهم عند المسجد الحرام حتى يقاتلوكم فيه فإن قاتلوكم فاقتلوهم كذلك جزاء الكافرين فإن انتهوا فإن الله غفور رحيم وقاتلوهم حتى لا تكون فتنة ويكون الدين لله فإن انتهوا فلا عدوان إلا على الظالمين. Which, for those of you who don't speak high 7th century classical Arabic, means fight in the cause of God those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for God loves not the transgressors. And slay them wherever you catch them, and turn them out where they have turned you out, for tumult and oppression are worse than slaughter. But fight them not at the sacred mosque unless they first fight you there. But if they fight you, slay them. Such is the reward of those who suppress faith. But if they cease, God is oft forgiving, most merciful. And fight them on until there is no more tumult or oppression, and there prevail justice and faith in God. But if they cease, let there be no hostility except to those who practice oppression.
Thank you very much for that, Hamza. Now, we're honoured tonight to be welcoming Timothy Winter, also known as Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad. He's been named as Britain's most influential Muslim by The Independent, and he's the Sheikh Zayed Lecturer in Islamic Studies here at the University of Cambridge. Tonight, as you can see, he'll be talking to us about the ethics of war. So, without further ado, please give me a hand in welcoming Timothy Winter.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Can everybody hear right at the back? This room has rather dodgy acoustics. If you can't, maybe the best thing is just to move forward. What I propose to do this evening is the perhaps slightly disappointing thing of going through the classical Sharia discourse on war and peace. Those of you who have come hoping for a lurid exposition or perhaps even defense of some of Al-Qaeda's latest statements and outrages, I'm afraid will be disappointed. As educated people, you'll know that there's a profound disjuncture between modern militarized fundamentalisms and the classical discourse of the monotheisms. It's perhaps a source of reproach to those of us who identify with the mainstream that we've not been able to suppress those extremes, but they are extremes. And it exists also in the context of other religions, including the Christianity, whose advocates quite often at least furrow their brow in the general direction of Islam and its teachings on militancy. So just last week I saw that General William Boykin has issued this pronouncement. General Boykin, by the way, is a leading Pentagon general. He was associated with the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia. He was head of Delta Force, led up the Pentagon's hunt for bin Laden, and has made some very pungent remarks about Islam and Muslims. So this is his latest input. General Boykin says this: "The Lord is a warrior, and in Revelation 19 it says when he comes back, he's coming back as what? A warrior. A mighty warrior leading a mighty army, riding a white horse with a blood-stained white robe. I believe that blood on that robe is the blood of his enemies, because he's coming back as a warrior carrying a sword. And I believe now, I've checked this out, I believe that sword he'll be carrying when he comes back is an AR-15. And the sword today is an AR-15. That's a semi-automatic assault weapon. So if you don't have one, go get one. You're supposed to have one. It's biblical. So the head of the Pentagon's hunt for the world's most wanted man turns out to be a Bible-believing, somewhat crankish fundamentalist. And of course, we all know that's not the mainline Christian view. The mainline Christian view, worked out with considerable acuity and sometimes a lot of moral agonizing from the time of Augustine to Aquinas, Grotius and others, is quite different from this sort of fundamentalist crusading chest thumping. And so it is, unsurprisingly, in the world of Islam. So what I'm going to do is to outline what I take to be the broad contours of the classical mainstream discourse, with a few reflections in the direction of how well this discourse fits the contemporary situation, not just because classical Muslim war theory presumes a world that predates the world of nation states, but also predates, of course, many of the modern ethical dilemmas raised by the possibility of modern industrial scale warfare. But worth mentioning in the context of that perhaps one of the characteristic definers of the modern situation has been, on the one hand, the elaboration of brave declarations about human comity and human rights, but at the same time a massively increased kill rate. That perhaps 90% of the casualties of the last 1,000 years in world conflicts have happened in the last 100 years, with the capacity for further mayhem only just around the corner. And it's interesting to note that over the last 100 years, over 80% of violent deaths have been the work of civilizations notionally or actually connected to Christianity, and fewer than 1% of violent deaths over the past century have been connected with Muslims in any way. Still, we have this message of the West as somehow spreading peace, justice and light, and the Islamic world is somehow irreducibly unstable and aggressive. In response to this, there has been Muslim pushing back, which sometimes makes things even worse. A discourse of Islam as the religion of peace, almost a pacifist kind of fluffy, daffodil-waving hippie religion that has no truck with any form of violence, that strange term that is now being used to reproach Muslims who have not renounced violence, as though the British Ministry of Defence has renounced violence, or the Pentagon has renounced violence. No civilization that will stand renounces violence. What we're talking about is the use of unprincipled and disproportionate forms of warfare, and forms of warfare that target the innocent. Still, this is really part of the mood music of the age, that Muslims are jihadists, that there is something inherently problematic about Islamic teachings on war and peace, and as a result, this counter-discourse amongst Muslims, borrowing a term that I suppose was first conspicuously coined, ominously perhaps by George Bush, Islam as the religion of peace, is gaining currency, and quite a lot of Muslim discourse now is backpedaling on some of the provisions of the classical Sharia, which I propose to outline. So this will not be an exculpation or any kind of apologetic discourse. I simply want to show, looking at the classical mainstream texts, what exactly the classical position was. Now, as usual, when one tries to look at the Sharia, one does not find a consistent answer, because the Sharia, and most of you already know this, is not Islamic law. The Sharia is a huge, diverse legal tradition. There are different laws and legal interpretations, policies with respect to how one interprets the scripture, policies regarding the extent to which reason or utilitarian considerations might be applicable, different views on the extent of the authority of a judge or a ruler. It's a very diverse legal tradition. So it's a little bit hard to offer a kind of simple encyclopedic set of generalizations about what is the medieval Sunni Muslim understanding of war and peace, and what are the boundaries about when you can go to war and what you can do when you are at war. However, if you look at the medieval manuals, you'll find that the law books do have chapters on jihad, and political theorists wrote on the subject in some detail. But on most points, the different madhabs, that is to say the four main interpretative traditions within Sunni Islam, are actually not united. This is one of the areas in the Sharia where there is a very great diversity of opinion. And one reason for this is that although in the Quran and the Hadith we find texts that, as it were, advocate courage and the martial virtues and chivalry, there isn't actually that much that can be immediately cut and pasted into books of law. These are general statements, advocacy of heroism and denunciations of cowardice. Most of the classical Sharia rulings on jihad are actually deduced by various raticinative procedures through analogy, or sometimes through consensus. This is qiyas and ijma'. And palpably these are shaped both by the exigencies of the Islamic world at the time those manuals were created, and also by the actual practice of the Muslim armies as they spread out in that perhaps historically unique feat of conquest, simultaneously conquering the east and the west more or less permanently. It was the practice of the conquerors that laid the foundations for most of the medieval jihad theory. So quite a lot of substantive rules of jihad are actually traced back to the Caliph Omar, for instance, the second Caliph, rather than back to the Quran and the Hadith. Rudolf Peters, who's written a book on jihad in medieval Sharia, says, "The doctrine of jihad became fixed in the latter half of the 2nd century." In other words, it's not primal, it comes about a couple of centuries after Islam has started to get significantly underway. And that's one reason why modernists have found it easier to reform this area of Islamic law, I think, than most others, because so many of the classical rulings in the legal text are based on various interpretative maneuvers rather than on clear-cut prescriptions or prohibitions in the Quran and the Hadith. The word jihad itself, you'll all know this, simply means struggle. And we need to unpack this at the risk of repetition. It doesn't mean holy war. We need to be aware of this because so often we're talked about jihad, we're spoken to of jihadis. The jihadis in Mali or the jihadis in Somalia, as though that term meant something. Well, it doesn't. It's not a classical Sharia term. It tends to be a word of journalistic denunciation of anybody who seems to be in a particularly extreme or disagreeable way imposing a particular interpretation of Islam by force. But it's not a proper term. Jihad itself means struggle, and even in the medieval period, long before modern apologetics, it was always acknowledged that the most significant form of struggle is jihad an-nafs, the struggle against oneself. Ibn al-Qayyim, for instance, who has a list of ways in which the word jihad can be interpreted, one of the leading medieval Hanbali theologians, says the most important form of jihad, its most significant application, is jihad an-nafs, struggle against the self. Struggle against the enemies of justice in the world is another one, but the principal use of jihad in the traditional Muslim imagination is self-discipline, self-restraint. This is generally, I think, nowadays not understood at all. So we don't translate it as holy war. The journalists all do, but it doesn't mean that. It means struggle. Struggle of any kind, if it's for a good cause. So the idea of holy war, in fact, is of Christian origin. Pope Urban coined it, really, when he launched the first crusade, Bellum Sanctum, a war that was holy in itself. And Islamic law has never regarded war as in itself holy. They say it's hasanun li husni ghayri. It's good because of where it leads, not in itself. It's instrumental. In itself, it's mayhem. But if it leads to some good, then it takes what they call hukm al-maqsad. It is given the quality of the moral judgment that attaches to its end. So it's not holy war. It's not bellum sanctum. But again, a word of caution here. Some modern Muslims will say it's just about the struggle within, and they try to deactivate the whole panoply of medieval Sharia rulings on jihad, and that again is unrealistic, because for the bulk of Muslim history, the word jihad has had the very significant connotation of armed, heroic struggle for the defense or even the expansion of the physical boundaries of the Islamic world. What are the sources for medieval Islam's law of warfare? It's interesting that despite the wide diversity that one gets in the manuals, there was a clear concerted determination to draw up a theory of the boundaries of appropriate warfare. This is quite unlike, for instance, the situation for the Romans, who in times of war would more or less carry out anything that seemed to be expedient. If you read Caesar's conquest of Gaul, for instance, and compare that to Amr ibn al-As and his conquest of Egypt, you see the total disjuncture between the two methods. It's not utilitarian, it's rooted not in what actually works, it's rooted in what is in conformity with the will of heaven. In theory, the ultimate source of jihad theory is the Quran. But the Quran, and the jurists are very aware of this, is a book which has a context. It's interacting in the first instance with pre-Islamic Arabian culture, and it's conflictual at its point of emergence. You might say that one of the, even though later on, and John Kelsey, who's written on, from a comparative perspective as a Christian on Islamic and Christian ideas, just war, has pointed this out. Just war theory does converge quite substantially with the medieval jurists' understanding of jihad. Still, the point of origin of the two religions is quite different. Christianity emerges palpably as a pacifist tradition. Resist not him that is evil, turn the other cheek. And then when it becomes a public religion, it becomes a majority religion of the Roman Empire, through Augustine and others, recognizes the necessity to have a theory of war. And mainstream Christianity has never been pacifist. That's there, but it's very much on the fringes. Whereas Islam emerges in a context of a quite drastic struggle for survival. The Meccan elite, even after the Prophet's exodus to Medina, is clearly hell-bent on extirpating the new religion and all of its adherents, and whenever they were given a chance, that is what they did. So in the founding documents, one finds these Quran cries for the necessity of these heroic virtues. Now, we know that the Prophet, in his first 10 years of the ministry in Mecca, there was not a possibility of any armed struggle. Muslims are too few. It would have been futile. Following the exodus to Medina, perhaps 1 year, perhaps 2 years later, we find this critically important verse which gives the believers permission to fight. And this is the verse, and we heard it earlier. أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. Permission is given to those who have fought because they have been wronged. And verily God is able to grant them the victory. Those who are expelled from their habitations without right, only for their saying, our Lord is God. So for the first time, this is a Quranic text which authorizes the believers to take up arms against the Meccans. Subsequent verses that urge the believers to take up the struggle with their goods and their lives, and promise paradise to those who lay down their lives in the cause. And this ushers in the category of martyrdom, which of course is also there in Christianity. The war memorial in my local churchyard is dedicated to the martyrs of the village, and there's a big cross. This is something that's very similar to the Islamic conception. If you lay down your life in defense of others, this earns the divine favor. So there's other verses then which deal with matters such as fighting in the traditionally holy months of Arabia. This is cautiously tolerated. And there are passages about prisoners of war, passages about truces. Now, the key question in all of this is whether this is outlining a model of defensive war, or whether the unbelievers are to be fought under all circumstances. Looking again at Professor Peters' book, he says it is not clear whether the Quran allows Muslims to fight the unbelievers only as a defense against aggression or under all circumstances. And there are actually verses that seem to support both positions. So for instance, Surah 2, verse 190, and fight in the way of God those who fight you but do not commit aggression. God loves not the aggressors, so don't fight an aggressive war. But there's other verses which seem to imply that fighting is to be a more or less permanent obligation and can actually be initiated by the Muslim side. Nowadays we might call this preemption. So for instance, 9:29, this is the so-called verse of the sword. Fight those who believe not in God and the last day, and do not forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden, such as practice not the religion of truth, being of those who have been given the book, until they pay the tribute out of hand, being brought low. So you have what is, at least for modern Western analysts, not entirely clear body of injunctions, and it's on the basis of these texts which the theorists then came to mine their rulings as the kind of basic injunctions. But as I said earlier, the majority of the classical fiqh rulings come from other sources. But again, our fundamental ambivalence, is this to be purely reactive and defensive, or can they be what Tony Blair would call a war of preemption? The commentators looking at these verses and making up their minds seem to have been influenced by two main factors. Firstly, there was a pre-Islamic kind of tribal norm in Arabia, which was in the air everybody was breathing, which assumed that a state of war existed always between tribes unless a truce explicitly existed between them. Secondly, further afield, there was the Byzantine military culture, which regarded the notion of religious war as perfectly natural. Just a couple of years ago in Vienna, there was a really important historians' convention specifically about Byzantine ideas of sacred war. So the context, beyond the scripture, the context in which the jurists are thinking out these scriptural texts is shaped by these two traditions, the old Arabian norms and the Byzantine idea of the sacred warrior. And the jurists, on the whole, reach the conclusion that the Quran does in fact require consistent military action against unbelieving peoples if no treaty exists with them. This is the bit that modern apologists find a bit awkward. But that's there in the text, that's what they say. However, there are lots of exceptions which are immediately made in those same texts. So for instance, the Maliki school, one of the four schools of Sunni law, says that there shouldn't be a jihad against the Turks, who at that time were Buddhists in Central Asia, and there's no need to fight against the Christian Abyssinians, and they found hadiths to justify this. Some of the early scholars regarded this jihad, what Muhammad Hamidullah calls idealist jihad. The whole world is to be subject to a divinely approved law, and injustice will be no more, as merely recommended, but the majority of the early jurists regarded as an obligation upon the Muslim community. So technically speaking, jihad was regarded as fard kifaya. That is to say, it's an obligation. If some people are doing it, and it's enough, then it doesn't become an obligation for everybody. Now, when the initial conquest had subsided, this duty continued, but in a virtue that was known as murabata. That is to say, one would volunteer to go to the front line for a certain number of months or even years. And to this day, you can find these ribat fortresses in certain places where these young men from around the Islamic world would go in order to man the fortresses, usually against the Byzantines. There's some old fortresses in southern Anatolia which date from this period, but elsewhere as well. For instance, if you go to the beach just south of Al-Altet in Spain, near Valencia, it's basically, there's about 10,000 Germans sunbathing. There's sand dunes, and in the sand dunes there is an Umayyad ribat, which has been excavated, which was built by the Umayyads as a defense against the Vikings, who would raid from the sea. And you can see how each one of the cells that these, as it were, warrior monks occupied, you can still see the mihrab, the prayer niche. So each one of them in their barracks had this tradition of prayer. You went on murabata in order to learn and to pray, as well as to exercise the martial virtues, a little bit like the so-called monks of war in Western Christendom, the Knights Templars, the Knights Hospitallers, but it would not be a permanent vocation. So this murabata was an important part of pious life in medieval Islam, volunteering for a few months at the front. So the jurists will talk about the ribat in these manuals, and then they go on to make a famous distinction between two parts of the world. They speak of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, the abode of Islam and the abode of war. That is to say, the abode of Islam, not just a place for Muslims, but a place where Islam may be freely practiced and where justice prevails. And the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, refers to any place where Islam is oppressed and where justice doesn't prevail. It doesn't mean the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. So a majority Muslim place can be Dar al-Harb, a majority Christian place can be Dar al-Islam. So the majority of the late 19th century Muslim jurists in India, for instance, decided that even under the British Raj, India was considered to be part of Dar al-Islam because the basics of the religion were being practiced and were not being oppressed. There's another category which is added by the Shafi'i school of law and by some others, such as Shaybani for the Hanbalis, which is usually referred to as Dar al-Sulh, the abode of truce. So as well as the abode of war, the abode of Islam, there's this abode of truce, which is places where there is a treaty relationship in place with a neighbouring Muslim power. And that's equivalent to, I suppose, the modern legal category of friendly nations. Further complication in the manuals, we find that the duty to take up arms against this abode of darkness and oppression is not always binding. Now, a region loses its status as House of Islam when its Muslims or the protected minorities are oppressed. So if the Christians or the Jews in a non-Muslim country next to you are being oppressed, that country switches from being Dar al-Islam to being Dar al-Harb. And some jurists, like Ibn Hazm, argue that since the Muslim state exists to protect the lives and freedom of worship of Christians and Jews, as well as Muslims, it's the duty of the Muslim state to invade a neighbouring country where Christians or Jews are being maltreated. He's living in a frontier situation in Spain where this was a live issue. So, and he comes up with a proof text, the famous hadith, who says, "Man adha dhimmiyan fa ana khasmuhu yawm al-qiyamah." Whoever harms a member of a protected community, that usually means a Christian or a Jew, I shall argue against him, I shall be his adversary on the day of judgment. So again, in all of this, Islamic law is assuming that war is a war against a neighbouring ruler and his practices. It's not against a neighbouring people or a religion. This is before the idea of nation state, and the idea of war against a religion would certainly not have been understood. Once the unbelieving tyrant ruler has been brought to naught, his people are to be allowed to continue with their lives as before. Another thing the jurists mention is who actually is subject to the obligation to participate in the jihad. Well, there are several exempted categories. Firstly, minors, and we have a lot of hadiths. The Prophet, for instance, forbade a 14-year-old boy from fighting at the Battle of Uhud. Secondly, the insane. They're not supposed to fight. Thirdly, slaves. Fourthly, women. So in a hadith, we have Aisha, the Prophet's wife, asking the Prophet to participate in the jihad, and he replies, your, feminine plural, jihad is the hajj. However, women are allowed to accompany the army to help attend the wounded, distribute water and so on, but only on condition that there's no risk that they might be captured. Fifthly, the ill are exempted, and the definition that the jurists give of that is that they're so sick that they can't ride a horse. Sixthly, those who can't afford to go. Remember, this is a volunteer culture, this is not conscription or a standing army. They can't afford to go, they can't buy a sword, a horse and provisions and provide for their families in their absence. They're not allowed to go. Seventhly, the Hanafi school, one of the four Sunni schools, says that if you are the leading jurist or judge of a town, you're not allowed to go because the civil society requires your presence. Eighthly, those who do not have permission from both of their parents to fight are not allowed to go. It's interesting here, according to the Hanafis and the Malikis, even if your parents are not Muslim, they still have the right to veto your participation in the jihad. And that's in the classical text, because of the idea of blood thicker than water, so they still have these rights despite the religious difference. Ninthly, debtors who have not been authorised to fight by their creditors. So if you've still got your Abbey National mortgage and you've still got 7 years to run, sorry, you can't go to war. And the justification for this ruling is that the rights of creditors, like the rights of parents, are individual rights and so take precedence over the collective rights of the community. And this principle is only overturned if the Muslim community is in imminent danger of invasion and destruction. in which case none of these exemptions apply. So, for instance, in the final Muslim defense of Jerusalem against the Crusaders, even little kids had swords, and it was that desperate. And similarly, the Mufti in Bosnia authorized women to fight when the entire Muslim community was threatened with extermination by the Serbs. But that's in extremis, that's an extreme defensive situation. The next thing the jurists do that's interesting is to discuss the permissibility of different kinds of weapons. There is no argument about whether you can use swords and arrows and mangonels, although there's arguments about mangonels. These are the big catapults that were used as siege engines before the invention of gunpowder. We know that the Prophet once used mangonels in the siege of the city of Ta'if, and they were used sporadically in later conflicts, even though the jurists are anxious about the possibility of what we would nowadays call collateral damage. But there are arguments over whether, for instance, it's legitimate to drown an enemy by bursting a dam or by burning them, as by setting light to a fortress. This worries them. And the consensus is that these methods are dishonourable and can only be resorted to if there's no other means of securing victory. Of course, any traditional general is going to say, the only way we can do it, burn their fortress. So in practice, these things were done. But it's important to note that the jurists do have hesitations about this, particularly in the context of a number of hadiths where the Prophet says, I have been commanded not to destroy people by fire, which is, as we'll see, still a live issue in the context of some contemporary weaponry. Can you attack if Muslim prisoners are being held in the opposing army or fortress? Some jurists, like Al-Awza'i, say that no, it's forbidden to attack. Other schools say it's permissible. And there are also rules which prohibit, for instance, the mutilation of enemy corpses. And this is called muthla. Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam naha anil muthla. He forbade the mutilation of enemy corpses. And there's also some grisly stuff, such as, for instance, you're not allowed to fire the heads of enemy casualties in your catapult in order to upset people who are defending a city or a fortress. It might be effective propaganda, but the Sharia doesn't let you do that. Who can be killed? All the madhabs agree that minors and women may not be killed unless they're actually bearing arms against the Muslims. And that's universally agreed, as there's a number of authenticated hadiths to this effect. All of the madhabs, with the exception of the Shafi'is, say that it's likewise forbidden to kill the aged, the insane, monks and priests, the blind and slaves. Some of the jurists say that if they're killed anyway, their relatives have the right to claim compensation from the Muslim forces once the conflict is over. Those who may not be killed or who surrender are to be taken captive. People who could not fight against Muslims behind their lines, like people who are not going to be dangerous, old men in wheelchairs, monks, the infirm and so forth, you just leave them alone. And the Maliki jurists, only the Malikis, insist that if the army is moving on, you have to leave sufficient provisions for those, for the conquered population before the army moves on. Communities which surrender peacefully to the Muslim army aren't subject to any taking of captives. Islamic law, and this was in practice a very important distinction, distinguishes between cities which are taken anwatan, by force, whose people may, with these exceptions, be taken captive, and cities captured sulhan, that is to say through peaceful submission, and those cities are just to be left intact and you can't interfere with them. Now at this point I want to raise some things that show how these traditional rules are under intense strain and in some ways don't actually work particularly well in modern conditions. I mentioned earlier that this is a medieval code where the honour of the warrior is paramount. The idea of chivalry, a kind of samurai-like warrior ethic, is all important, and you can even endanger your chances of success in order to ensure that you are acting chivalrously. In the context of modern warfare, how much of that can still work? And this is a major question for contemporary Islamic ethicists and theorists of war. How much of this Sharia rather strongly emphasizing image of what you can and cannot do in a war. How much of that is actually going to apply nowadays? So, for instance, one case, cluster munitions. You'll know that to this country's everlasting credit, Britain is one of the first countries to have signed the international conventions banning cluster munitions. These are the completely horrible things that, for instance, Tomahawk cruise missile, near its target, releases 166 bomblets, and each one explodes and fires these flechettes. They're arrows specifically designed to cut human flesh over a wide area. And very often, it's about 10% failure rate or dud rate. These bomblets don't actually explode, but they're sort of attractive things for children to pick up in subsequent years, and they can remain contaminating or interdicting the landscape, sometimes for decades. So, for instance, there's 60 million unexploded cluster munitions in Laos in Southeast Asia, left over from the time when the Americans were just plastering the whole country with these munitions. And several hundred people, usually children, are maimed or killed every year in Laos, and it's incredibly difficult to identify them and to safely dispose of them. It's very expensive, very labour intensive. They've still got 60 million of these things, theoretically at least 60 million casualties. After Israel pulled out of southern Lebanon in 2006, at the very last moment they bombarded southern Lebanon with cluster munitions. They haven't signed the convention. The Americans and Israelis have not signed the convention. So there's an estimated 1 million unexploded bomblets all over the hills and the olive plantations of southern Lebanon, and people are still getting hurt by them, and it will be interdicted for a long time. And this is something new for the Sharia. Nobody in the Middle Ages envisaged that even the day after a battle, the battlefield might still be dangerous. Something quite new. So the question is, has the tradition the resources to come up with a reliable fatwa on cluster munitions? As far as I can see, although in discussion with individual jurists they strongly disapprove, I haven't seen any of the major international fiqh academies actually urging Muslim countries, many of them have signed up anyway, to sign up to the convention which bans cluster munitions. So we have potentially a Sharia crisis here, a completely new type of weapon, characteristically modern in its efficiency and its intractability. Can the Sharia deal with it? Another example, depleted uranium. The Americans used these a lot in the first Gulf War. And they're very effective in reinforcing the casings of tank rounds. They become much more effective in piercing armour, but it's uranium, so when it explodes it becomes an aerosol which then is radioactive and gets into people's lungs. Most of the research that has been done has focused on whether returning veterans actually do have an increasing rate of cancer, and the indications are, from some surveys, although it's fiercely contested by the Pentagon, that male soldiers who were part of that campaign are 1.8 times more likely to contract cancer, and females 2.8 times more likely to contract cancer, or children with birth defects, which is another consequence of radiation poisoning. So Iraq now has the world's highest leukemia death rate. And in a 2012 study, the people of Fallujah have the world's highest rate of genetic damage of any population ever studied, simply because of the intensity of the modern high-tech munitions that the Americans were pouring in and their local allies into the city of Fallujah. That again is radioactivity, radiation poisoning, birth defects, child mortality many times higher than the Iraqi average in Fallujah. What is the Sharia to make of this? And again, I haven't really been able to determine a fatwa, even though depleted uranium, for obvious reasons, is not supplied to more than a small handful of belligerent nations in today's world. But it's an issue. Another issue, aerial bombing. The Sharia has this set of very admirable reservations about what you can do in war, and you have to make sure that civilians and women, children, monks, slaves, whoever, are not in the line of fire. So what about nuclear warfare? Well, nuclear warfare in a sense is just a subset of the larger problem of aerial bombardment, which is part of the modern normalcy of waging war. Around Cambridge, you have these former Second World War Bomber Command aerodromes. Bourne was a major one. Take, for instance, I think it's ironic that it was on the 11th of September 1944 that the city of Darmstadt was destroyed. That was by 5 group of Bomber Command, many of them flying from around here. And it was a city that had no military value. There was just one small chemical factory there. But because they destroyed Berlin, Hamburg, and the other places, they had a go at Darmstadt. 80% of the city was destroyed, more than 12,000 people died, mostly through asphyxiation or flooding, because with the firestorm, the oxygen is literally sucked out of the air. The fire burns out the oxygen, and there's a high wind. People are carried along by the high wind, and that's how most people die. Very horrific, very disgraceful. What does the Sharia make of that? When the Holy Prophet says, I have been commanded not to destroy people by fire, if he's not talking about that, what is he talking about? So, another example of how the Sharia is being pressed by these contemporary issues. Now, what we find is that when Muslims do reflect on these, they say, we too exist in the modern Westphalian model of nation states. We have to have ministries of defense, we have to have air forces, we have to have the capacity for deterrence, and there has to be at least a rule of proportionality. If they're doing it to us, and we'll do it to them. That's how Churchill justified what he called the terror bombing in the Second World War, which killed about 600,000 civilians. Proportionality, retaliation. So this is the argument that is cited, and of course there's justification for that in certain interpretations of Quranic text. ذَلِكَ وَمَنْ عَاقَبَ بِمِثْلِ مَا أُوقِبَ بِهِ ثُمَّ بُغِيَ عَلَيْهِ لَيَنْصُرَنَّهُ اللَّهُ. It's in Surah Al-Hajj. And if one has responded to injustice to no greater extent than the injury he received, and is again tyrannized, Allah will help him, for Allah is pardoning and forgiving. So if you react to somebody else's offense, but not going beyond what they have done to you, it seems that you enjoy the divine favor. But does this really extend to Western-type weapons of mass destruction? Or is it really envisaging a world of bows and arrows? Well, looking at nuclear weapons, apparently if less than 1% of the world's current stockpile of nuclear weapons was actually used, 1/6 of the world's population would die, and mostly through massive changes in global climate and famine. In other words, most of the people who would die would be people far from the conflict zones, completely innocent. So we do have a current Muslim discussion on nuclear weapons. Of course, the flashpoint is whether the Iranians are developing them or not, and the Iranians are saying the Israelis have them, so maybe we should have them. Proportionality, deterrence. But the official Iranian position is that they're not developing them, and Ayatollah Khamenei and the others have said that it's not permissible for Muslims to use nuclear weapons. That's for those barbarian Westerners, and we know what they did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but of course we would never do such a thing. Here is an interesting ruling from Taha Jabir al-Alwani, who is the Iraqi former head of the Fiqh Council of North America. Weapons such as nuclear and chemical weapons are not permissible to be used against the enemy, because by the nature of these weapons you can't differentiate between the innocent and the criminal. If we look at this, we wouldn't allow any nuclear chemical weapons which would kill the innocent and the aggressor, especially from the Islamic point of view. Allah Almighty says in the Quran, "Nor take life which Allah has made sacred except for just cause. And if anyone is slain wrongfully, we have given his heir authority to demand retaliation or to forgive, but let him not exceed the bounds in the matter of taking life, for he is helped by the law." So he's using that ayah as a proof text really against the legitimacy of nuclear weapons which claim such massive collateral casualties. And then he comes up with a number of quotations. So, for instance, from Abu Bakr, the first Khalifa, "Do not commit treachery," instructing his army, "do not commit treachery or deviate from the right path. You must not mutilate dead bodies, neither kill a child nor a woman nor aged man. Bring no harm to the trees, nor burn them with fire. Slay not any of the enemy's flock, save for food. You are likely to pass by people who have devoted their lives to monastic services. Leave them alone. This is a famous khutbah by Abu Bakr when he's talking to his army as they're about to go into action. Basically, he's giving them a list of stuff that they're not allowed to do. So, from Tahir Jabir al-Alwani's point of view, this necessarily encompasses something as arbitrary as the kind of weapons of mass destruction which have been generated and used by Western civilization. Not possible for Muslims to use that. But the argument is not closed. So A'id al-Qarni in Saudi Arabia is one of the sort of Salafi world's most widely influential preachers, has on many occasions says that the Muslim world has to acquire nuclear weapons as a matter of urgency. So he says the world only respects the strong. To produce one tank would be better than 1,000 poems. He's reacting against the tendency in some of the Gulf states to build museums of Islamic art and opera houses and to turn people's attention to matters of culture. He'd rather have nuclear weapons. So he says this, for instance: there are buildings currently being occupied by minor daily newspapers that no one reads, and cultural heritage museums housing scrap metal, worn-out rope, blunt axes and other artifacts. These should all be turned into factories to manufacture tanks, rocket launchers, missiles, satellites and submarines, so that the world comes to respect us, hear our voice and appreciate our status. It's not really about chivalry or rights or anything like that. It's about respect us, hear our voice and appreciate our status. That's A'id al-Qarni's view. It's a widespread view among some of our angrier brethren. So we haven't come up with any kind of consensus on this, unfortunately. But here's a voice that is more measured and does actually seek to root the fatwa in classical discussions. This is Sohail Hashmi, who is Pakistani, particularly concerned with Pakistan's acquisition of the bomb. And you may recall when the Jamaat-e-Islami recently had a big demonstration in Lahore, and as part of the demonstration they had these cardboard nuclear bombs, and they had the Islamic bomb written on them. The Pakistani establishment would say the Indians developed nuclear weapons first, we have to have it. After all, the West justifies its own nuclear weaponry as deterrence against the former Soviet threat. Why can't we do the same? They have that utilitarian discourse. But Sohail Hashmi takes a different view, and you can see his article, it's on the web, I think. Reasons for the prohibition. Firstly, nuclear, chemical and biological weapons do not permit a level of discrimination between competence and non-competence that is required by Islamic rules of war. Second, even if such weapons could be employed strictly against military targets, they kill or maim in such horrible ways that they violate Islamic teachings on fighting humanely. Third, they wreak lasting damage on the natural environment, but must be considered in Islamic moral evaluations because all life has worth as God's creation, quite apart from any utility derived by humans. And then the Quranic quote, there is not an animal on earth, nor a bird that flies on its wings, but they are communities like you. That's Surah 6:38. Destroying or damaging the natural habitat of species unable to defend themselves against human attack constitutes the height of what the Quran labels fasadun fil ard, corruption in the land. Fourth, because such weapons cannot be used for any morally defensible purpose, any expenditure to develop and stockpile them, any resources diverted from other constructive purposes amounts to what the Quran and Hadith condemn as israf, or waste. And then he goes on to supply a list of proof texts indicating why it's necessary to protect crops and livestock. He points out that the Prophet never killed animals as a tactic of war. Sometimes, for instance, in the siege of Banu Nadir and the citadel of Thaqif, he did cut down orchards in order to dismay the defenders, but that was as far as it went. So again, the famous speech of Abu Bakr, you shall not fell palm trees or burn them, you shall not cut down any fruit-bearing tree, you shall not slaughter a sheep or a cow or a camel except for food. So this indicates that even the Holy Prophet's practice was either abrogated by one of his later practices or was particular to a given situation. It was mukhassas, not a general rule. The last question which arises is automated battle systems. This is the so-called robot war scenario. much of the Pentagon's current research budget is given over to the automated battle systems, and they're very popular and very safe, at least from the point of view of those who are operating them. Even though they seem to have lost the war in Afghanistan, the only thing that is working for them is airborne assassination from the Predator drone strikes. And the question now arises, and there have been a number of sort of discussions on ethics forums, as to the extent to which these automated systems should become autonomous systems. The RAF calls them UCAS. You students think UCAS stands for something a bit different, but for the RAF, UCAS stands for Unmanned Combat Air Systems. And the idea is that the major reason why people are killed in error in battlefield is because of human error. And if you eliminate the human element in war, then you eliminate the possibility of killing in anger or out of revenge or some extraneous factor, and you only kill those whom the machine has been programmed to recognize as a legitimate target. So the idea is that the drones in future, the algorithms have already been developed. Somebody who's at the RAF Academy told me that this has actually been used in practice, but not by this country, is that the drones will hover for days over a sector in territory that is under occupation, and the algorithm will kick in when it sees a certain configuration on the ground. So if it's a bunch of men around a large lump of metal, it will assume that that's a weapon and it will open fire. And that's said to be actually more reliable and to produce fewer civilian casualties than if you have somebody in Virginia, they like to dress up in sort of fighter pilots' uniforms, even though they're behind a desk, pressing the button and zapping the Taliban or whoever it might be, maybe farmers with a tractor, he doesn't really know. But in any case, this is happening constantly on a daily basis. There's dozens of them in the air as we speak. So the question is, what does the Sharia make of automated battle systems, which seem to be at the opposite pole of the spectrum from the traditional chivalric idea of only slaying those who you actually slay personally with your sword. It becomes completely mechanized. And of course, it's not just aerial systems, but there will be in future completely cybernetic battle tanks, which will be programmed to destroy everything that moves in a particular grid reference, for instance, and would be extremely difficult to take out because they could be enormous, withstand immense forces, continue to fight when a human being would not be able to continue to fight. And this is one of the large issues now in the ethics of war. Are we moving towards a world in which, because of the sensitivity of Western populations and electorates to body bags, that wars will be entirely automated? And the next time there's an Iraq, they just send in robots and zap it from the sky, and there's no white Christian casualties at all. And the journalists certainly not going to go anywhere near that because that's really dangerous, and nobody will really know. But it could be politically a very attractive option. So that's another example of how the technology has really outstripped the Sharia debate. Of course, it's unlikely that Muslim states are going to be using such automated systems anytime soon, although the Iranians claim that they have a drone, but I suspect that it's not as sophisticated as the American automated systems. I guess I'm out of time. I've spoken for about an hour. What I've tried to do really is just to map in as hopefully objective, descriptive way as I can what the classical manuals of Sharia say about who you can fight, who you can't fight, who should fight, who shouldn't fight, how you fight, and what are the boundaries of a legitimate war. And then to end with a reminder, if one be needed, that the Sharia is under incredible strain under modern conditions because of, in this case, the incredible destructive power of technology when applied to weaponry. And there'll be more and more wonders in store, no doubt. Another aspect of it that I didn't talk about is the use of sanctions, for instance. Almost 1 million people killed by sanctions in Saddam's Iraq as a kind of continuation of war by other means. It's happening to people of Gaza at the moment under very acute blockade. Another aspect of it might be For instance, one of the CIA reports is actually online, it's not classified, is about the use of automation in interrogation. Because if a robot is carrying out interrogation and putting a suspect in certain stressful situations, it's much less likely that that individual will die, because the robot will be monitoring the pain level, the medical sort of statistics of the subject during the interrogation. And of course wouldn't have taken the Hippocratic Oath, which is another thing that is being debated at the moment. So all of this is certainly something in store for your generation to look forward to. Just around the corner, I think. How the Sharia deals with that is an interesting question. Personally, I favour Suhail Hashmi's view, which is that we can't go down that line. Western civilization has opened a kind of trapdoor into the infernal regions, and we saw where that could lead, not just the bombing of Darmstadt, but Auschwitz and the catastrophes of the 20th century, which were kind of mechanized attempts to fast forward Darwinism from a certain perspective, and that has nothing to do with not just Islam, but any religious civilization. And there's plenty of fellow believers in other religious traditions that also draw the line at these and say that even if you're going to be defeated, that's better than incinerating somebody else's capital. It's just too bad if you're defeated, but you can't do that. God will judge you harshly for such an action. I believe there's time now for questions, and I think unless there's a sudden storm of opposing voices, I can probably just share this myself. So just stick your hands up when you're ready. How long do we have altogether? And is there official kicking out time?
15, 20 minutes.
15, 20 minutes? That's fine. Who's first? Yeah.
You mentioned that some people say that the default for Muslims is to be at war with non-believers. But how is that sort of, well, when fundamentalists argue that that's the reason they kill innocent, how do you, what's the solution?
Well, because that classical position was an interpretation of the medieval jurists. But the modern jurists don't hold that view, and they say that in a world of nation states where Muslims sometimes are better treated outside the Muslim world than they are by their own governments, it just is a meaningless category. Yeah.
According to Islamic Sharia, who can authorize war? Does it have to be the state, or that it can be any random group like region?
That's a good question. It has to be the Amir, the head of state, the Khalifa in the classical view. There are some scholars, interestingly Al-Ghazali is one of them in his Al-Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, who says that certain groups, militias as it were, can take the law into their own hands if, for instance, you want to go and smash up your neighbour's sort of selling of drugs, equipment or alcohol. You don't need permission from the state to do that. That's a controversial view though. But overwhelmingly it has to be the Amir who gives the permission, and his Mufti is the one who authorises it. These modern Al-Qaeda type groups are completely, they're just outlaws from the strict medieval perspective. No legitimacy. Yeah. Well, there's a certain way in which ethics are ethics, and a casualty is a casualty, and most of the issues, I think, are shared between human beings irrespective of their religious affiliation. I think that the Muslim hesitations about nuclear warfare are probably shared in a very similar way by adherents of other religions, and probably some secular people as well. So I think it would be inappropriate and unnecessary to designate a specific kind of Islamic ethical code for those who are serving in the British Army. Of course, there are issues regarding when it is permissible to fight or not, and we don't have conscription in this country. People do volunteer for these campaigns. But again, if you have ethical problems about being sent to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it might be, that's not a Muslim-specific issue. There's probably Christians and others who are also not sure whether they should be doing it. The churches were against the Iraq war as well as the mosques. But yeah, it's a sensitive subject.
Picking up on this traditional distinction between having avoided Islam and avoided that somehow suppresses Islamic practices, how would you say that coherently applies to the state of affairs in countries now where even if Islam isn't actively suppressed, it's not kind of channeled into any legal expression? So I guess some countries in the West.
Well, what the jurist said, for instance, in British India, was that Darul Islam is not the land in which all of the rules of the Sharia are applied. That historically has hardly ever happened anyway. But it's the land where Muslims are able to practice the basic obligations of the religion. They can fast in Ramadan and they get halal food, and it's those things. As far as I can see, almost all of the mainstream jurists now have abandoned this Darul Harb, Darul Islam dichotomy, which is not from the Quran or the Hadith anyway, but was a medieval construct. I think it's vanished without trace. Because everybody knows that Muslims are often better treated. For instance, probably easier to be a Muslim and speak your mind in modern Britain than, say, in Egypt at the moment. So what could such a distinction mean? Yeah.
If you're looking at a different angle, for example, if you're looking at two Muslim states, what does Islam generally speak on the ethics of war? For example, the 1990 war between Iraq and Kuwait. Where would the distinguishment, or how would that be classified?
Yeah, the question is about conflicts between Muslim states. The classical jurist would say that you should not get involved in a conflict between Muslims. And this was the way of in a sense, it's what defined one's identity as a Sunni Muslim. The first Muslims were divided. Some became the Khawarij, they fought against Imam Ali. Some became the Shia, they fought for Imam Ali against some of the other of the Salaf. The Ahl Sunnah were the people who wouldn't get involved in those disputes at all, but tried to include everybody. So in a sense, the Sunni response is not to get involved, because it's just fitna. As we can see, that wherever Muslims do think they can take sides in a civil war situation or an international conflict situation, they always regret it. I mean, where is there an example of Muslims taking sides in an armed conflict in recent times where the outcome has been a positive one? Don't know. I mean, look at Syria. It's not looking so good. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you mentioned actually that there are rules about who's allowed to go and join the war and who's not. However, in times of extreme situations, those rules don't apply. Does that mean that in times of extreme situations, even the ethic of war don't apply?
The extreme situation means that you and your community are about to be exterminated, so you can give a gun to your child and to your wife, and and the insane, and everybody participates. But that doesn't mean that you can do to them whatever you feel like doing. It's about defending the community and who can be armed.
Yeah, so if we take that one step further, like in theory, Muslims shouldn't have these nuclear weapons, but they're in a situation that the only way for them to defend themselves is by having nuclear weapons. Is it still forbidden?
My perspective is that it would be forbidden, because if they used them, they would be breaking all of the rules about the sanctity of life and contaminate the earth. It's fasadun fil ard. I said that there are certain situations where it's preferable to be defeated and just to deal with the consequences than to be guilty of an atrocity. Yeah.
There's concepts about, for example, immunizing your whole population against disease and then spreading the virus to your enemy. What are your thoughts on biological use?
Well, I think that would be another example of how a modern military possibility is clearly a violation of our ethos. If the enemy population is primarily a civilian one, then it's entirely unacceptable. But I don't think that any military ethicist in any culture at the moment would validate the use of such weapons. It is theoretically possible to target certain ethnic groups, for instance, on the basis of DNA and other markers of ethnicity, but it's a violation of the relevant Geneva Conventions.
Yes, you talked briefly about captives. And, do captives become slaves in Islamic, classical Islamic state?
It depends on the decision of the one who's in charge of the army. On the classical model, he can decree that they should be enslaved and distributed at a specific moment after the battle is done to the victorious troops, or he can let them go. In contemporary Islamic law, I'm not aware of anybody who upholds the continuing validity of that. It was a decision taken by some early jurists, but it's not a religious axiom. Generally, there's no Islamic jurisdiction today where a contract of slavery or indenture is still recognised. So it's just a theoretical issue. Some of the extreme Al-Qaeda type factions will try to resuscitate it, but that's outside the framework of the Sharia.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or more specifically Hamas, and the weapons used by each side. How do you see the ethics of war applied to this specific case? Though there might be other similar cases, like maybe Assad and Syria now. But if we take this case, how do you see these ethics applied to the Islamic community in Palestine? And would you say that they're now in one of the extreme situations where some of the rules can be ignored because of the current situation they're in?
The rules that are to be overturned are only the rules concerning who can be armed. They have nothing to do with what you can do to the enemy, and that's very clear. But the Palestine situation is a kind of icon of a problem which is global now, which is that very often wars are incredibly lopsided. In Afghanistan, you have mountain men in plastic sandals being zapped by 21st century Star Wars technology, and it's completely inequitable. So does that mean, as some of them would claim, that they can break the rules and target civilians and blow themselves up and use the only weapons that they have at their disposal? I don't believe that that works. I don't believe that religion is about breaking your own moral principles out of necessity. And it's not clear at all that the Palestinians have gained one little bit from, say, using suicide bombing.
But then, how can someone do what the verse says, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ وَمِن رِّكَابِ الْخَيْلِ تُرْهِبُونَ بِهِ عَدُوَّ اللَّهِ وَعَدُوَّكُمْ, to create fear in their hearts. And if those really powerful weaponry are not being utilized by Muslim communities, then they are going to be far more powerful than the Islamic army.
Yeah.
So for them to be of any cause of fear.
Because it doesn't significantly put fear into them. In fact, it causes, the leaders of Israel, whenever they go on fundraising trips to the United States, and often they talk to the big evangelical communities, sometimes they even bring a suicide bomber's vest just to show them what they're up against, and they get more donations. Nothing has contributed to sympathy in the West for Israel more than Palestinian attacks. So it doesn't frighten them, it makes them more confident of the success of their propaganda. If you look at any of the security digests which are there on the internet, you can see what a godsend suicide bombing has been for Israel. It makes a lot of sort of swing voters in the West not support the Palestinians any longer. Yeah.
Under the Sharia, is a preemptive strike by a nation state justified?
Preemptive strike, yes, it can. If you can see that the country next door is preparing to attack you, you can do that. And that's the case in most versions of Western just war theory as well. But in the case of Iraq, of course, it was bogus because there's no way in which Britain and America were going to be attacked by Saddam with his mythical weapons of mass destruction. That was a spurious use of the principle. Yep.
Is there any general priority for dispute settlement, peaceful dispute settlement, or for example, treaty negotiations? And secondly, are there any limitations as to the subject of the treaties? What can be negotiated? Could a country give up land and sort of allow another country sort of take over the land in that regard?
Land for peace. Yes, you can do that, particularly since the Sharia doesn't really pay much attention to territory or borders. This is to some extent a modern Westphalian idea that I will abandon this province in exchange for a tribute to. This is kind of a modern conception. In terms of, remind me of the first part of your question.
The sort of priority.
Yeah, the priority.
Before you
Sure.
enter into war, for the extent to which you have to negotiate, how much you have to negotiate, whether you have to seek an existing court system, international court system, before you actually enter into a non-peaceful.
Well, in the time when the Sharia manuals were formulated, there wasn't an international court system, but the Prophet's practice was always to try and talk people around before there was a war. You have to remember in the context of the Prophet's conflicts that you're talking about very small, mobile desert skirmishes. The Prophet unifies Arabia mainly through negotiation, strategic marriages, political, diplomatic skill. It's been calculated that fewer than 1,000 people died in all of his campaigns on both sides. And he unified Arabia, which had never been done before, and saved countless thousands from the tribal wars that had always been happening there. So where we look at prophetic precedent for something that would work nowadays when people can press a button and obliterate cities, again, the analogy is often specious. But yeah, his practice was always to negotiate first, to have delegations wufud come to Medina, and he would engage in half of the seerah is about that. And the actual skirmishes, the actual wars, very small. Yeah.
Given the damage, destruction of what leads to some of the contemporary scholars, it says that Muslims should not only oppose the war, try to avoid participation in the war. Just one question is, what's your view? Majority Muslims take that view in that case, not participating, they like weak force or weak argument. What should be our alternative in that case? We know Muslims, majority Muslims together, they will front of the West, they will destroy, they can't, and it will lead to destruction of the world. It's not an option. So what should the Muslims, what should we focus on rather than war?
The jurists nowadays would say that the principle of jihad refers to defensive war. If you're attacked, you have to defend yourself. And that's not just a national principle, but it's something, if somebody attacks you and your family in the street, you have to defend them. So I don't think Hamza Yusuf is saying that we should be pacifists.
No, I'm not suggesting he's saying we should be pacifists. We know that wherever there has been war in modern times, people dying. Enemies in some way.
But there can be contexts where it's essential. For instance, in Bosnia, if the Muslims hadn't got the weapons that they got from here and there would now not be any Bosnian Muslims left, because the ones who fell under Serbian control were raped and killed. Srebrenica, everywhere. So, in that context, there was a legitimate fatwa, and it was a defensive jihad, not morally problematic. But in a lot of conflicts between Muslims nowadays, it's much murkier. And a lot of people don't really see what's going on in Syria. Most of the fighting is between different groups, not between the groups and the regime. The Libyan revolution has led to probably worse instability than they had under Gaddafi. Most of these conflicts have not delivered. But that doesn't mean that you can ever take up arms.
like to think is generally ethical rather than instrumental. That is, how much are this ethic discourse more of an excuse to failing to develop these instruments from the Muslim world? That is, or how could the ethical argument become the instrument in a victimized discourse?
You mean, is the reason why there isn't a developed Sharia discourse the fact that it's somebody else's weaponry and isn't something that's emerged indigenously?
That is, how much of that sake of criminalizing these weapons, rather based on the fact that Muslims have failed to develop such technological weapons, rather than an ethical take on it.
Yes, it may well be that it's a discourse of the weak. But my suspicion is that in the context of classical Islamic civilization, had, for instance, Islamic civilization won the clash of civilizations and was now regnant, I suspect that the jurists would still not be authorizing chemical weapons, area bombing of civilians, nuclear weapons, because it's so obviously alien to the spirit of the hadith. I don't think that they can be legitimated, or they ever would have been. Yeah, you've been very patient.
I think there's a conflict between the idea of not being aggressive and fighting people who don't believe in the Quran, and if so, how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, as I said, people are not fought for their belief, they are fought for what they have done to certain categories of the weak. The Quran, where it urges war, tends to explain that that's for the sake of the mustad'afin, the people who are oppressed. And one of the reasons for the success of the early Islamic conquest was that the conquerors were by and large supported by many of the minorities who'd been kicked around by the Byzantine and the Persian elites. It was essentially the Jewish community that invited the Muslims into Spain, for instance, because the Visigoths had treated them so badly. Many of the Christians of Egypt had been badly treated by the great church in Constantinople and were very happy for the Arabs to invade, and it was the same in Iran. So the Quranic ethos is not that you fight people for their belief, but because of certain entailments that belief might have in terms of what is being done to populations. It's not like the traditional, say, Reconquista ethic, or the way in which the Spanish Catholicized Latin America, which was that the indigenous religions were just evil and they had to be extirpated, so that within 20 years of the Spanish reaching Mexico City, everybody was Catholic. That never happened in the Islamic world. The Muslims were in India at the same time. Most of the population of India was still Hindu. So there wasn't a war on the religion. There was a war on some of the political instantiations of cultures that were attached to that religion, some of the things they were doing. But the idea of kind of a genocidal religious war is really, you hardly see it in Islamic history. The Western Christian history, it's unfortunately common. Yeah, maybe one last question.
What are the rules around the use of deception in war? Who can or can't use spy?
Again, this is a question that the jurists would deal with in the kind of pre-internet age. Nowadays we know that one of the big things they're doing is reading all of our Gmails, and megatons of information is being stored in case it's useful for their security agendas. But in the medieval times it was assumed that you can use trickery and you can use deceit in order to secure military advantage. It was not seen as problematic at all. Okay, thanks very much. Is somebody going to say a few final words, or are we done? Yeah.
Many thanks to the Shaykh for his insightful talk and for taking quite so many questions. A few announcements. There's a feedback form at the end of your tables. There's also a section below for those of you who couldn't get your questions answered today. I've been told that they'll be answered on Friday at 7 p.m. at Sydney Sussex College, where you'll apparently be able to grill a Muslim. There are some refreshments outside with tickets on sale for Saturday's closing dinner, which will be themed A Taste of Ramadan. The price will be £7 for members and it will be free for non-members. And there is some literature at the back, some Quran translations, if that takes your fancy. So thanks very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the talk today.